Okay, so today, guys, we're going to start talking about chapter 9, 10, and 14. And it's rather an interesting process because it deals with electing. It would have been really neat if we'd been able to do this before the election. But this is all about the concept of social choice, and it's also about the concept of satisfying preference. In other words, if you had a choice of things to pick from, and you point to what you want to pick, if there's a limited set of objects and other people have to pick, there may be some resolutions that have to be done. And it becomes a division problem, and there's lots of strange things that get involved. So we're going to really look at this presentation from a sense of social choice. But I want you to realize that voting is a choice of picking. It's a concept of choice, and it's very personal dependent. For example, you might not like a chocolate bar and there's a Twix bar in the mix, but then there's a nut bar and you can't take the Twix because it's chocolate, so it's really not a choice, it's a dependency on that you can't have the one or the other. And we want to somehow be able to bring these things into play. First off, we are going to view it from a voting point of view, but I want to point out that voting is much like picking a team. You take turns and you choose a team, and this causes some unusual things to occur. So first off, the idea of preference is pretty simple. You have a list of choices, and this is your first, second, etc. That's a preference list. Now, sometimes there's a tie, and we could create a preference list that would look something like this. It would be your first choice, but then it would be third. These two are equal. And then comes a fourth. So in some sense, these are both your second or both your third. They're equal, but that can create a mathematical difficulty. So in track and field and other things, when we have a tie for a second place, we end up saying they're tied for second. Other times they say they're tied for third. It's just a very unusual question of how we're going to say it. Well, let's just make life a little bit easier and say we're not going to worry about this happening within a voter's preference. So we're not going to allow it for simplicity's sake. So if you have some votes, you're going to be able to write down your preference. Now, we typically do it this way. Let's say there's three candidates. A is Al. B is Betsy. Well, that's archaic. I'm obviously old. And well, let's keep with that that theme. C is Charlie. So you're going to vote between these three. A common way we list this preference ballot is quite simply, we say voter 1 says A, C, B. Voter 2 says B, C, A, and let's have a third voter in there. Voter 3 says C, A, B. So this could be an example of your ballots that you cast. These are called preference ballots. And what that means is voter 1 likes Al the best, then Charlie, then Betsy. Now, we can also add numbers to the top because there can be a single voter that has a common with another voter. So let's cross this off and let's do 4, 3, 1. What would that say? Well, that would say there were 4 people that liked Al, Charlie, Betsy. 3 people liked Betsy, Charlie, Al, and 1 person that liked Charlie, Al, Betsy. And if you total up the top of the columns, you can see that 8 people voted. So this is what we call a preference ballot. The preference ballot has some very, very useful things that we can talk about. Let's suppose there's no winner after the first round of voting. We go to the ballots like they did in Georgia, and there's no winner. Well, what do? That means we have some sort of runoff when we go vote again. But the advantage with the preference ballot is if somebody had voted A, B, C, and then we decided to have this runoff, well, maybe B was eliminated, then we can just cross it out in his ballot. We know this is the first round. We know in the second round, he would want to vote A, C, because B no longer exists. This is a really powerful idea, and that is we don't have to use the cost of running a second round of election to do this. And so there are some nice advantages. All right, so that's the things about preference ballots. Let's now just talk about our various different methods of voting. So first off, we have the American system. And ours is called plurality. That simply means most wins. So for example, we could have 5 people voted for candidate A, 7 people voted for candidate B, and 3 people voted for candidate C. Americans would say, yep, B wins. But I want you to notice that that's not quite the type of system that other countries have, and they have a very specific reason not to like this system. And this is, if you look at this, right now B's countrywide support is 7 out of 15. It's less than 50%. So in some sense, you could argue that B does not have the support of the population. Therefore, it's not a good idea to use this system. For example, we use the electoral system. It is possible not to get the popular vote, but when the electoral system, and people have argued that's a bad system for that inherent reason. So plurality doesn't necessarily look like the support of the people, a mandate to rule. Now, there's another form of election called majority rule. And it says you must get a majority of the voters. Well, that leads this situation to some sort of runoff. Now, in some place, they just let them all candidate again, and then they have a voting. A very interesting one is when you vote for a new pope. The cardinals meet and they cast votes, and there's a leader and there's a trailers, but they throw nobody away. Every single person is in the second ballot again. In fact, everyone's in the ballot. Any cardinal can be voted as a pope. So the runoff just simply says, vote again. Now that's kind of a boring thing. It means that you'd have elections after elections after elections if the one candidate had this person that was always in the mix, the C who's messing it up for everybody, that people are voting for perhaps ideologically. So when you have a runoff, there are rules to eliminate candidates so it proceeds expeditiously. So there's what's called the eliminate the worst, or there's just keep the best. And both of these techniques have to define what you mean by the worst. The bottom one, the bottom two, this one, the bottom top two or the top three. We have to have some form of saying that. But that's what a majority rule system works for, so that when it finally gets done, there is a vote where somebody has the majority of the votes. Now, what we're going to do next is we're going to talk about a system that is called a head-to-head system, because it produces a voting system that's really neat. How do you determine the best football team or the best soccer team when it's really hard to have people go head-to-head in everywhere, a complete round robin? But let's just start with it. These systems have complete round robins. This is where, let's say we have teams 1, 2, 3, and 4. Each of these edges represents a match. And so let's suppose that when it was team 1 versus team 2, team 1 won. Team 2 versus team 3, team 2 won. Team 2 versus Team 4, Team 2 won. Team 1 versus Team 3, Team 1 won. And T4 versus T1, T1 won. Well, now you have a list of records. I want you to notice that Team 1 is 3-0. It beat everybody. Team 2 is 2-1. Beat 2 people, lost 1. Team 3 lost. Did I not get them all? 3 versus 4. Yeah. Team 3 versus Team 4. Who should we have? Let's have Team 4 one. T3 is 0-2, and Team 4 has won 1 and lost 2. So there we go. Obviously, Team 1 is the best team. Well, what happens if we did this in voting? In other words, when you vote, we ask you, do you like candidate A better than B? Then, do you like candidate A better than C? So if we did them head-to-head, imagine the following preference ballot. We have a voter that wrote A, B, D, E, C. That actually says a lot. It says that he believes that A is better than B, and A is better than D, that A is better than E, that A is better than C, that B is better than D, that B is better than E, that B is better than C, that D is better than E, that D is better than C, and that E is better than C. So in other words, when you vote with the preference ballot, we can have you participate in a round-robin tournament. We can take all of these votes, and we can measure your head-to-head success. That's kind of cool. And then apparently the winner would be the one with the most wins, maybe. But anybody who's watched football, you know that sometimes there's one team's 8-2 and the other team's 8-2, and there's ties. So this head-to-head and these complete round robins, it has difficulties. First off, ties. Takes a long time to do. You can use the preference ballot, but it's complicated. A lot of people don't really like that. Now, you can maybe do partial round robins. What's that? That's where some people play some other people. And what often happens with partial round robins, you follow it up with a final. So in soccer, they'll have Group A, Group B, and Group C, and they'll have some winners emerge from the group. They do a complete head-to-head in the groups, but then they go on to some sort of final competition. So partial round robins are very common. But what else can we do in the head-to-head? Well, why don't we just make a bracket? We put our candidates here, and some winner emerges here, and some winner emerges here, and there's some winner of the whole thing. That could be our voting process. May not be a bad process, might be a good one, fewer rounds. But as anybody who's been involved in tournaments knows, there's always a question of, well, what place was I in the whole mess and process of things here? So these are the head-to-head forms. This is a head-to-head bracket. How many additional forms of voting might there be? Well, there's a lot of forms of voting. I like the middle school form, what we call approval voting. What's approval voting? Approval is where I give you as many votes as you like to place them with any candidate. So your ballot might look like this: A, B, C, D, E. You don't write down 1, 2, 3, 4. You just write the ones that you like. So that candidate just voted for A, C, and D. And the next one might have voted like that for D and E. So everybody lists the people they're happy with. And then we can determine who gets the most votes. Now, there's another voting system called negative points, or what used to be called black marks voting. They still actually use it in a lot of debates. Thumbs up, thumbs down. You get too many thumbs down, you're out. So losses only matter So typical in debate, 2 losses, you're out. And then they repeat. Now, that's a different form of voting. You're not voting for who you like, you're voting for who you don't like, and they're eliminated through repetitive rounds. This is a repetitive round process. Now, these are just some of the forms of voting. In fact, in stockholder meetings, there's another form of voting entirely. It's called weighted voting. Weighted voting says you get a different number of votes depending on certain rules. For example, in stocks, if you own 10 shares of stocks, they'll give you 10 votes. If you have 1 share, you get 1. So you cast stock for each vote that you have. It's a lot like buying a raffle ticket. The more raffle tickets you have, the better chance you have of winning. So weighted voting systems, they actually allow people to vote multiple times when other people can't. So this brings us to the question of what would we be interested in a voting system? By the way, we're still going to look at a couple more voting systems. What would we be interested in? Our interest. Well, we want the vote to be fair. This is our social meaning here. So let's just take, for example, at one time, women weren't allowed to vote. So we could say they get to count 0 votes and a man gets 1. So the number is different. Therefore, it's unfair. Used to be property owners were the only one votes. So if you didn't have property, you got 0 votes. We don't like this. So we want the vote to be fair. So here's some basic ideas behind this. First off, each voter gets the same opportunity and method. So if somebody gets 5 votes, I get 5 votes. If somebody can mark 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I can mark 1, 2, 3, 5. There's no difference in how we cast or what we do with our votes. That's a basic requirement. This is a requirement for the treating the voters fairly. Well, how about the candidates? Each candidate is required the same threshold to win. In other words, you don't need 60% of the votes to be reelected. You need 51, a majority. Now, some voting systems, like for example, when we're trying to override a presidential veto, requires a much larger number than 50% to defeat that action. So thresholds can vary for different actions, but all the candidates have to have the same type of threshold. Another measurement of this is that the candidates have equal difficulty to win. Not in terms of the way the contest is held in popularity, but the method by which they win. They don't have to do extra steps compared to another candidate. Now, what else do we want to be fair in the voting system? Maybe we want some other sets of basic rules to be called basic fairness. Well, here's a strange rule, but it makes sense, but it turns out that it's subtle. More votes must help that candidate. That seems pretty clear, that the more I vote for someone and someone else votes for them, the additional votes should help them. That seems like a very basic criteria for a fair voting system. And I kind of like that, being able to say that. The strange thing is, how in the world can this come into play, that someone can get more votes and than another candidate and it actually hurt them? Well, we're going to see that. There's another one here that it seems like it should be basic, and one shouldn't have to say it, but if everyone likes A better than B, it might be that C is a better candidate. Everybody might like C better than A. But the important thing is everyone likes A better than B. Then B can't win. That seems a fairly reasonable, basic idea. Now, you should start seeing that I'm bringing up kind of a lot of issues about what we consider basic ideas of fairness. That's because all of these issues come into play. All of these things are important because voting systems all have issues. So here is a very important fact. There is always a fairness criteria that any given voting system will fail. In other words, if you come up with a fairness criteria, I can come up with a voting system that will demonstrate that that voting system doesn't work. And even more, given groups of voting criteria, enough cause no voting system to work. In other words, if we list enough voting fairness criteria, you can't find a voting system that's going to allow it. So let me point out what happens with plurality. Our system plurality, something odd happened in the year 2000. In the year 2000, we had Bush, Gore, others, Buchanan, Nader, just call them other. And nobody got a majority. And when it was all said and done, it was said that Bush was the winner. That's how our system worked. We figure out who got most. But there is one voting system that demonstrates that the people in general wouldn't be happy with such a voting system. Let's just imagine that there was a vast number of preference ballots that had been used. And it turned out that when you supported the other, very seldom did you support Bush. In other words, when you supported the other, your second choice was probably Gore. So let's just notice that maybe 48% supported Bush, 47.5% supported Gore, their first choice. And then what remains, what is it, 3.5%, or is it 4? It's 4.5% supported other. Now, it seems pretty clear that this other candidate is very weak. So if we had used not a majority system, not a plurality system, but if we had used a majority system, then we have every reason to argue that the other should be cast aside, that they're not relevant. And if indeed this other one is cast aside and we had a runoff, it would have turned out that 48.2% were for Bush and 51.8% were for Gore. Now, what method could allow us to do this without having a runoff? Well, we could use a preference ballot and we could have done head-to-head. In other words, it's very possible that in a head-to-head fight, Gore destroys the other. Couldn't happen. Bush destroys the other. He doesn't have much support. But if you did Bush versus Gore, Gore wins. In other words, when we talked about reading ballots in a head-to-head method, it's very possible that Gore could have gone 2-0, Bush gone 1-1, and the other 0-2. A plurality is a cage match, and a weaker candidate can actually seriously damage a stronger candidate, siphoning off votes, we say. So why do we use plurality? Well, it's fast. It is quick. There's a term called effective, and that is that the ability to determine that the election is simplistically done in a way that people will understand. The counters understand it, the voters understand it. It is effective for the people to view. But obviously, in the 2000 election, it seems that a greater percentage would have preferred Gore over Bush. But for some reason, these people chose to cast their votes for other. If we had a slightly different voting system, might have had a different answer. So it seems clear that the voting system itself seems to be picking winners. Because if we used a head-to-head here, Gore would have emerged as the winner. So why don't we use head-to-head? Well, it's not nearly as fast. It's almost just as quick, but you have to run the ballots more than once, so hence it's not quite as effective at telling people how this works. Now, how many things do we really need to worry about right off the bat in Chapter 9? Well, first off, we need to understand that there are certain methods and things that we say that measure fairness, and they're important enough that we give it a name. So the Condorcet method is a head-to-head, and if you win all, you win. So you beat everybody head-to-head, then you're a winner. We use the Condorcet win criteria to measure other voting systems if they're fair. So I just pointed out that plurality is not what we call Condorcet win criteria fair. Plurality is a cage match. If we had put each person head-to-head and asked you to vote, Gore would have emerged the best out of the three candidates. So Condorcet's method of a head-to-head voting is one method by which we might measure other voting systems if they're considered fair. Well, how many ways can we measure fairness? Well, first off, those basic fairnesses, that voters get the same number of votes or the same method. Winners need to have the same thing in there. Well, there's another thing that we like to measure about voting, and this is called manipulation. What happens if a voting system has a method by which the candidates or voters can manipulate the outcome? That sounds really bad. So it would be nice if we had some non-manipulable situations. This is very important to understand. Now, as time has gone on, we've seen that many people have used these voting methods. For example, we've instituted for the first time in some of the northeastern states a ranked choice or a preference ballot, so that if somebody doesn't get a majority, they will cancel out the losers and reread the cards. This causes a little bit of difficulty. A lot of people do not like this system. Why? Well, because it can cause some failure of certain voting systems. Now, let me point out why preference ballots might be subtle. Suppose we have lots of candidates, let's say A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, and you were to rank them this way. There's your vote. Now, what happens if, when you get down to F and G, you really don't know a lot about them, and heck, I put 6 and set it in front of 7, or 7 in front of 6. In other words, this was a real iffy assignment for you. Well, suppose you're changing of F and G thoughtlessly, or you don't know anything about it, actually change the election. Let's suppose B wins this election for whatever reason, whatever voting system. But if you voted slightly different, and you wrote it 7-6 here, and this caused C to win. That seems like a terrible consequence of a voting system, that subtle changes in irrelevant votes to you can change the election. Worse yet, neither of them are winners. You changed a winner based on irrelevance. When, from your point of view, irrelevant alternatives are messed with, are just subtly done incorrectly, and it changes the election, that's a method of measuring of whether something is a fair voting system. And that criteria is called IIA. And that criteria is the voting system independent of irrelevant alternatives? And there are several versions of irrelevant alternatives. For example, what happens if right now E was winning, but if you switched F and G, you got G to win? That's kind of a stronger form of irrelevant alternatives. Some irrelevance to you, when you switched them and gave them more votes, they won. But this is a more subtle version of it, where two people are messed with that are irrelevant, don't seem to win the election, but when you change them, it causes a change in the election. That's called a strong version of independence of irrelevant alternatives. Well, when we look at voting systems, then somebody might say, well, how often does this happen? How many problems does a voting system have? What's unfair about this voting system? And all of these are kind of important to talk about. So I'm going to now mention a couple of voting systems that are very common. One is Borda, 2 is Hare, 3 is our plurality, and 4 is majority, and we say with best runoff. Because it turns out the system called Hare is a majority system, but it uses with cast out the worst. So both of these, majority with best runoff and majority with cast out the worst, are two common systems that are used. In fact, Georgia right now uses majority with best runoff to determine Senate candidates, and this is why Georgia has not finished their senatorial voting. We had 2 people that didn't get the majority. They have to have a runoff. They use majority with best runoff. Hare system is frequently used in Australia, England, and many parts of the EU. Borda happens to be a point system, where if somebody votes for, let's say, candidate A in first place, they might get 6 points. But if they put candidate B in second place, they'll get 5 points. And we'll continue that pattern down. That way, every vote that you cast has a meaning. That's the Borda system. And our system is plurality. It turns out that these 4 systems are enough to demonstrate that things go really crazy quite regularly. It just happens. Now, let's stop right there.